Hey everyone, welcome back to the QTube. My name is Karina Rivero, and I'm here with feedback on your submissions from the Daily Dweebs composition task you had during March. Today we're going to be talking a lot about things, but first of all, thank you so much for all the effort you put into the writing, into the spotting, into the production, everything basically. We had a lot of fun listening to your submissions at the QTube at the Film Scoring Academy of Europe, and we are looking forward to hearing more about your work in the future. So, yeah, without further ado, let's dive in. Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is the great job you all did in different areas, but in general, I found that there are four things that stood out throughout the submissions in average. And the first thing is we had a very wide range of stylistic choices that were used in different cues by different composers. We had things going from orchestral to Americana, gypsy jazz. We had a very nice cue that used the 50s cartoonish kind of style, very Mickey Mouse. There was a cue that used hip hop and synths that was super interesting. We had a cue that was blues, etc. So we had a lot of music going on, and this just proves that any kind of music can be film music if placed appropriately against the picture. So good job on that. And yeah, good job on the musical ideas that you used, whether they were rhythmic or harmonic or melodic, textural, in orchestration arrangements. Like we had a lot of musical ideas that worked really well with the picture, and it was surprisingly joyful to watch all of them just flow. And that leads me to the next point, which is the understanding of Dixie. Like the flow of these musical ideas was very well knit, and it felt that everybody had a very good instinct on how to deal with our main character. Its playfulness, its silliness, its pace, its communication with the secondary characters, with the small chicken and the big chicken. So, yeah, good job, y'all, for understanding Dixie and playing along with it. It was super fun watching and listening to all of your cues. And an honorable mention is that a lot of you scored the opening titles, and that is actually a really good idea. And those of you who did actually probably very instinctively set a mood for the story that we were about to join for about a minute and 10 seconds. So, in doing that, you established tone and emotion. And we went into the story with that in mind and with that basically in our bodies. Like whether you set a more joyful, playful tone or a little bit mysterious but also playful tone, like all of that matters. And in this kind of film, it makes us receive the main character with a lot more information than otherwise. So yeah, good job on those four things. And now we're going to move on to the actual feedback section of this video. We're going to be talking about four core areas, which are storytelling, composition, orchestration and arrangement, and production. Everybody has something to get better at all the time. That's how life works, right? So your cues were all given feedback in these four different areas, and hopefully it'll be useful for your projects moving on in life. All the feedback we're going to be talking about is more like a discussion. Like I would want you to think of it as a spectrum, because in this industry there are not right choices a lot of the times. It's more of choice A, choice B, and the spectrum that falls within the two choices. And the right decision often comes down to context, whether a scene is placed at the beginning, at the middle, or at the end of a film. And yeah, what kind of emotion we're feeling at that point. Probably at the beginning, we're not feeling the sadness for the loss of a character because we haven't gone through the process. It also often comes down to the directing from the director and how they feel something should flow. So yeah, take the feedback more as a trigger for your brain to think about things, what you did and what you can do different, better, or even worse, why not, in the future. So the first core area is storytelling, which is really our priority and our number one job as film composers. And let's talk about hit points. A lot of you marked a lot of the hit points, and that's great. Like, these kind of film calls for Mickey Mousing a lot, and it works very well. So in a lot of cues, it felt like there were hit points missing, or probably a lot. So we're going to be looking at two examples of kind of the opposite. There's a cue that didn't hit a lot of points, and there's a cue that hit a lot of points. And let's talk about that. So here's the first one. Okay, and let's listen to the second one. So when we listen to the first example, there aren't a lot of hit points being met. It mostly works as a general piece of music that permeates, or that that goes from the beginning to the end, but it doesn't have a lot of changes that respond to Dixie's emotional changes or Dixie's actions or the chicken actions, whereas the second one hits almost everything, or everything actually. So ask yourself, which one feels truer to the story? Personally, I would say probably the second one has a lot of more match to Dixie himself. He's a little character that has a lot of emotion, that's playful, that its gestures are super big, and probably the music wants to accompany that and be part of that too. Again, in this kind of film, that is kind of instinctively what the picture is asking for. The other one sounds more like an ad, kind of, and that's great. If this was probably an ad for some kind of, let's say there's a plot twist, and somehow this ends up being an ad for a car or a gym membership, I don't know, something, then maybe it fits, then maybe it's perfect. But the overall context is not giving ad, it's more giving narrative, storytelling, action, match, make actions bigger than they appear on screen. And music really helps that. The sound is also very large. The expressions are, they're very large. The movement, like everything kind of calls for that more Mickey Mousing approach. That means we have to hit a lot of points during the story. So yeah, think about it again. Now, let's talk about what happened with character identities through your music. We're going to watch now two clips from a submission by the same person. And there's a question about how to treat the secondary characters. Sometimes we want them to have themes and motifs, and sometimes we don't, because their emotional universe is not that relevant to the story, and we want to focus on the main character. But sometimes we do. Some of you scored the smaller chicken and the bigger chicken, some of you didn't. And doesn't matter, it doesn't mean it works or it doesn't, it means you made different choices. But sometimes there was an inconsistency to this, so let's watch what this means. The first clip is the introduction of the smaller chicken. let's watch a clip from that same submission, but the introduction to the big chicken. So what it feels is that the small chicken doesn't have as much importance as the second chicken. Why? Because there's not as much of a musical shift when the little one appears as there is when the bigger one appears. So there's an inconsistency there. Is inconsistency a good or a bad thing? We don't know. There's not necessarily, but maybe in the global arc of your cue, it could be great if you're going to have one, then have the second one. So you can contrast. If there's a small chicken, that's a little threat, and then there comes a big threat because they kind of represent that. Like a small threat is manageable. Dixie kicks it out. Like, go away. The bigger chicken, he gets scared. But then it's manageable too, and he ends up chasing it outside the screen, right? So think about how to potentially make that theme consistent. The theme or the topic of threat. Not chickens themselves, because chickens are a placeholder for something else. So yeah, think about that consistency, and it in a short story like this, which is super, super beanie, a minute-long story, it helps to round it and to make it like feel more complete. Okay. And our final topic of discussion for storytelling is, let's talk about how emotions can be underplayed or overplayed. Remember, we're trying to follow Dixie throughout this story, and his emotions are really huge. So how do we actually match that? Let's look at 2 examples and talk about them. Think about how these 2 clips made you feel differently. I would argue the second one has bigger musical gestures that accompany what Dixie's going through, but it doesn't mean the first one is like too light. The instrumentation is different. Like the percussion is used as a main instrument to provide context, whereas in the second one it's more of grander orchestral gestures. So it just gives different depth to the same emotion. And you want to be careful to not underplay those emotions. You want to be careful to actually match what you want to match. In both cases, the global arc kind of makes sense in their own musical context. But just be aware of what the audience is going to feel when they listen to your cue and they match it to the picture, because this is a whole experience. You can't subtract the image from the music or the music from the image. You have to like look at it as a complete emotional and experience package. So don't forget that, and replay if you need. Like, it's super clear how both are giving just different depths to Dixie's emotions. Okay, so these were probably the main things that stood out in the storytelling realm of the submissions. And now let's talk about composition itself. Because music is the craft after all, right? We're composers, first and foremost. So everything kind of ties back to storytelling in this case because we are film composing, right? So let's talk about, first of all, tempo and energy. It ties a little bit back to what we just talked about, but let's look at it in a different way. Let's look at it in a way that what's the tempo you would have chosen if you could change your cue right now? And let's look at two examples. It's not just tempo, like we know that. It's style, it's instrumentation, it's rhythmic cells, it's how articulations are chosen for the melody. It's everything, really. But even a slight tempo shift, probably in the waltz option, could have fitted better the inner pace that the story has. Probably just a little bit bouncier, just a little bit faster. Think about it. I'm thinking about it right now. The second one is a little bit more lively and kind of matches the playfulness. It kind of matches the walking pace of the characters we're seeing. So, yeah, remember to sit down, and brainstorming is great, and just drop your first ideas and put them into DAW, but come back to them, because who knows, maybe you had a very sad day that day, or maybe you were in the right energy mindset, and you can always fix and shift things around. And there's something unspoken about composing to picture, which is just that empathy with the characters we're seeing. And if you feel that there's a click that you feel sometimes, it's really hard to explain. But when you feel that click with the energy, with intention, with emotion, when you're basically acting out internally what's going on screen, that's when you know. And if your music matches that intention to what's going on screen, that's magic. That's the magic of actually writing music for film. That's not something that usually happens. That's kind of the spark of inspiration that's not really there all the time. But when it does, use it, harness it, and put it in your music. So yeah, tempo and energy. Now let's talk a little bit about idea consistency, which is really important because we want to remember things. We want to remember where we came from, and that's why we have different repetitive structures throughout different styles of music, whether it's jazz and we have AAVA structures, whether it's pop and we have an intro, verse, chorus, verse again, pre-chorus, whatever. Structures and repetition makes us remember things and makes things memorable. And a lot of you did that. A lot of you, let's say, for example, you had a very good idea for the opening titles or for Dixie's introduction, and then you repeated that at the end, in the end credits. That was awesome, and it felt well-rounded, and it felt like the story had a beginning and an ending that made sense. So let's look at two examples where we're going to watch the whole film because it makes sense to watch all the structures. One where there were probably too many new ideas going on, and one where there is repetition of structures and repetition of musical elements. Now let's watch the second example. So I want to ask you, which one do you like more? Or which one do you feel more attached to or attracted to? Which one are you humming after listening to it? Fair enough. Sometimes remembering something has to do with order of appearance, and the last thing you hear is often the one you end up humming, because that's how it works. But again, it doesn't mean that one or the other works or doesn't work. It just makes it memorable in different ways. I feel the first one has a very good idea of how to make an emotional journey and how to drive us. We're basically a passenger, an emotional passenger in this emotional car, where the composer took us through all the emotions, really, like from joy to sadness, and then and kind of new material towards the end and the end credits, which is great. Like when we watch the film, we don't automatically think, oh, it doesn't work, that's awful music. That's not true. It's actually great music. So just probably there were a little too many ideas, and one or two of them could have been repeated. And in the second one, there's a lot of repetition and variation, but on the same thematic material. And what that does is it anchors us to Dixie, because most of the repetitions happen when Dixie is on screen doing something joyful in general. We also have different moments for sadness and for both Chicken's appearances, and that works really well. And it's just that, like, it anchors us to a character and its main emotion, its main personality. And at the beginning, we understand Dixie. In the middle, we kind of come back to that so we don't forget. And at the end, just rounds it and we go back to that. And it feels like Dixie just started a new adventure again, like the beginning. So yeah, think about how much repetition you think feels right for your cues and how much new material you want to make the audience listen to. Because ultimately, repetition makes us remember things, and that's human nature. That has nothing to do with composition. That's just the result of everything we are. And on the same note, let's talk a little bit about motifs and themes. Let's watch these two, and let's talk about whether you want your cues to feel more thematic and to have something that you end up humming, or whether you want them to be more of a underlying and something that accompanies more in a textural way, in a rhythmic way, but not necessarily in a melodic way. Let's watch. Actually, let's switch it up. Let's watch this one first. And now let's watch this one. in this kind of film, when you introduce a very strong theme or leitmotif, what that does, it speaks for the characters, especially in a film like this that has no dialogue but has a lot of reactions, and characters do have a voice. Kind of, Dixie has a voice. It's kind of a dog, kind of sound designed. It could have been anything, but it speaks words that characters can't. So when you introduce a motif, that's basically the character speaking. And when you don't, what it does is it gives more space for the characters' just natural sounds to come through. Especially, again, in a film like this, which is animated, which has a lot of sounds going on. And could potentially even have more. Like, think about maybe when Dixie moves its neck, it could have gone whoosh or something. And a motif kind of overpowers that because our brain automatically goes to picking that up and to pick up the pattern and register it and memorize it and then expect it later. Whereas where you don't, you just kind of sit back and feel the emotion and feel the action develop like above your music. So think about that when you're writing a motif, and especially if you're working something like a feature film or a series even. How often do you want to repeat that? When do you want to introduce that? When do you think it's appropriate to make a giant orchestration out of that? Triple octaves, I don't know, like put it everywhere in all registers, in every instrument, or maybe just a little bit of it in a single instrument, super thin, or just a little part of the theme and not everything. Like, there's a lot of things to consider when you're writing a theme. And if you do it right, you're not going to overpower the action, and you're going to do it very tastefully and place it just where it needs to be. This is a really good example because you probably want it a lot of times. You probably, like, one of these two examples uses the same melodic material and then changed the instrumentation. I don't really remember right now what it was, but when the small chicken appeared, there was an instrument shift, and that worked really well. That probably wouldn't work in a different kind of film, like a drama, for example. So okay, so let's move on to our third core area of feedback, and that is going to be orchestration and arrangement. And orchestration and arrangement is mostly an area where you want to focus for purposes of storytelling multiplying. And what that means is you basically want to like support even more whatever the emotion is at a very specific point in your story with either thicker textures, a specific instrument. Let's add orchestration, arrangement, and instrumentation. Like everything that has to do with timbre and with texture falls within this core area. So let's talk a little bit about thick and thin textures, which in this particular case means basically how many families we're using from whatever our ensemble is, whether it is the hip hop cue or it's the blues cue or the orchestral cues. Let's talk a little bit about how that affects the storytelling in particular. So let's look at our first example over here, and let's start again with the one on the right. Okay, and now let's take a look at the one on the left. Okay, so both of them are very different styles, and they both kind of need a little bit of more support within the stylistic choice that both composers made. This second example, which is the blues cue, it relies heavily on the piano, but we know it could do something else. We know what composer who did this, you could have used more bass, you could have used, I don't know, like steel guitar, you could have used drums. Like there are a lot of more elements in a blues ensemble that could have supported the story and the composition itself. So there is a little bit of a lack of intention in the music in terms of instrumentation, orchestration, arrangement. And it feels a little bit not even naked. It feels like bare bones a little bit. It has the idea, the musical idea flows, the rhythm especially, like it flows and it gives us context, but it is a little bit lacking in the instrumentation department. And now let's listen to the first one again. That first appearance of the theme, dum, bum, 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 with it's a little bit naked as well, and it's probably in a register that won't cut through really in a very memorable way. So maybe using a higher register instrument for the main theme would have been a good idea, just in this case. Because obviously, like if you use a lower instrument for whatever purpose in a different kind of cue, like it can work. It can work very well. But we've been talking about energy and perception, and usually higher instruments in a cue like this kind of potentially fit the playfulness and high energy that Dixie has. So yeah, let's just watch it again one more time, and just like it feels a little bit thin as well. Also, those trills and the flute, like what about supporting them with strings, maybe tremolo strings, potentially? Again, the musical idea is great, it works, but supporting it with more stuff sometimes works out. There are other examples where less is more, sometimes more is more. Really depends. So now let's talk a little bit about character through timbre. This was a very common area of opportunity for a lot of composers in this task. Because a lot of the times when you establish a theme and then you want to vary it to introduce a different character, it is very important to change timbre, which really just means change the instrument. And that'll give a new context with the same melodic idea or the same harmonic idea or the same rhythmic material to a new piece of visual information. And this happened a lot, especially with the appearance of the bigger chicken or the smaller chicken. So again, let's take a look at two different examples and what happened. I think this one's super clear. Like you have a very strong A section and then it repeats. Amazing. How about changing the piano for a different instrument when the small chicken appears? That would have been great. And it would have given a different context, a different emotion, while at the same time keeping the musical idea going, the momentum going. Everything keeps going as it is, except the instrumentation. That would have been great, just for a little bit of contrast. It's not bad, it works, but it would have been a little bit better, I think. And now, for our second example. So in this second example, the actual point, the what I want to focus on is the small chicken versus the big chicken. Like, there's a lot of consistency in Dixie's theme, but there are little variations. There's no melodic, like very important content when the both chickens appear, but there are instruments that kind of signal a different kind of emotion, a different weight from the characters. And let's look at, I don't know what this light changes. Like, there's percussion going on, and that works. There's like very light, very high percussion going on when the small chicken appears, and that's great. It signals lightweight. And it kind of syncs to what the small chicken is doing, which is great. And then when the bigger chicken appears, there's low brass, and that fits perfectly to the bigger chicken weight itself. So timbre, instrumentation helps a lot. Again, this is like super clear and very, very in your face. This is a very in your face kind of story. So it's super easy to be transparent with it and look at elements like this musically, and it just makes sense. But there are more complex stories that will require a lot of thinking from you and a lot of like trial and error from different kinds of orchestration and different kinds of instrumentation for you to kind of nail what a character or what an emotion is, especially in longer formats. So yeah, take that into account. And then now let's move on to our final core area of feedback, which is production. Production is usually that's usually a very important area where a lot of composers struggle, because there's a lot of different things we have to deal with. We have to deal with compression, EQs, reverbs. We have to deal with processing and doing it in a serial way or in a parallel way. There's mixing, there's mastering, there's routing, there's buzzing. There's a lot of things we need to learn that don't necessarily translate directly into musical terms, but sometimes they kind of do. So I would suggest just keep learning about it, keep watching tutorials, keep taking classes on that, because production is super important. And a lot of times, directors or clients will look at production first, will listen to production first rather than the music. The music might be great, but if the production is not nailing it to their ears, they will think the music is bad, which is not necessarily true, but they don't know. And we have to make sure as film composers that the message is communicated as efficiently as possible. And this is how you do it with good production. So one of the main topics that was consistent throughout the submissions was space and distance consistency. A lot of times the elements didn't feel quite in the same room. They didn't feel like they were talking to each other in the same space. And yeah, let's take a listen to a few examples of how this played out. So this is a very clear case of how two things can feel in two completely different universes. The bass is kind of drowning in reverb. It feels like it's in a very huge space, whereas the piano feels like it's super close. You can hear super clearly how the keys are being like pressed, even like you feel close to the piano and super far away from the bass. And not even that, it's not really a matter of distance in this particular example. It's a matter of they just feel like they belong in different musical spaces completely. And the music itself is kind of calling for for a mutual communication of the instruments in a similar space. So just be careful with that. And let's take a look at this second example. Again, feels like two different worlds. There's a hi-hat that's super close. It's almost playing in our ears. It's even as if we had our head super close to the hi-hat and we were listening specifically for it, like just centimeters away. And then there's the orchestral stuff, which is happening further away. So they're not really communicating. This is both a matter of distance and spacing. The elements feel just not connected to each other, so just be careful. Work on it more, visualize with your ears, if that makes any sense. Imagine the sound you want to achieve, study the sound you want to achieve, listen for references, the same way you do research for your music and look for references for mixing. Listen to them, tune yourself to that kind of sound, and learn to imagine it, and then apply it. Topic number 2, and one of the things that require the most practice of them all, which is media realism. Just program a lot, practice every day, work with your MIDI CCs, with your control changes, work with your modulation, your expression, your vibrato, learn your libraries, learn what works and what doesn't work with each one, learn how velocity affects different libraries, read the manuals, and make sure you practice a lot. Again, listen to things that are real and then apply that into your MIDI programming. It's super important, super important. And again, what clients and directors are gonna listen for is good production, good sound, and it has to be attached to the music. Like, you can't deliver amazing music without having great production. So let's take a look at 2 different examples. From this particular example, I want to retrieve the strings in particular. String programming is very good for practicing because strings can do a lot of things and a lot of articulations, and the range is huge from the basses to the violins. So practicing with strings is one of the best things you can do for your MIDI programming skills. Make sure the articulations match, because this cue kind of has the intent of feeling staccato and short notes, but it kind of sounds like the patch used was more of a legato one or not as short one as it could have been. Also, the reverb is a little bit weird. And a great tip that a lot of people use is usually you want to layer more than one string patch from different libraries. A lot of times you want to layer probably a bigger string section and then have either a solo string patch on top of it, just to give it a little bit of roughness, of realness, of closeness to that strings and the harmonic content from the section, from that solo string patch. Or perhaps layered with a smaller section. Like, say if you have a full symphony, like, I don't know, 11 violin section, 18 violin section, whatever. Maybe layer chamber orchestra section, probably just a smaller size group of violins or violas or celli or basses. Or maybe even layer the 3 of them and see what happens. Make sure, again, to listen for references, find the real stuff, and tune your ears to that. Let's listen to a second example. From this example, it was super fast. The machine gun effect. Let's listen to it again and you'll know exactly what I mean by that. The machine gun effect is super common, especially when you're programming drums. A lot of times when you want to hit like fills, or it happens a lot with snare drums. When the dynamic's not varied enough and you keep your velocity at the same value, machine gun. You don't have any variation, and that's not what happens in real life. You want a little bit of variation. So make sure to work on your micro dynamics a lot, so you don't get that really weird effect. Okay, and finally, our third topic for production, which is the overall mix with the sound design. Remember, you're not working alone in a soundtrack. A soundtrack, with the space in between, a soundtrack includes the sound design and the music. And sound design in itself is an art that consists of many different layers, Foley, backgrounds, dialogue, a lot of things are going on, and you are basically another layer. And what re-recording mixers will do is think of you as a layer, and you will be in a Pro Tools session or whatever as a layer. So you are in a storytelling kind of way and in a sound way, you are talking to other elements. You're not alone. You're not the only one conveying meaning. So make sure that your mix does that as well. Automate your track. Work with the sound. Sometimes you'll be the protagonist and the main character of the soundtrack, and sometimes you won't be. And you have to recognize and you have to be able to address that. So just keep practicing and have the emotional intelligence and the storytelling intelligence to know when it's your turn to shine and when it's not. So let's listen to a couple of examples and see what we think about them. And the second one. I think it's super clear what's going on. Sometimes it's just a matter of volume. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have to work with your register, and sometimes maybe your orchestration will be muddy for the dialogue, and the dialogue won't cut through the mix, and we don't like that. So in this particular exercise, it's mostly about volume in general. But be aware that it's not always the case. Sometimes you'll have to thinner your orchestration to make room for other elements. And that's very common. And that's a thing that only happens when you're scoring to film. That doesn't happen in other kinds of composing. So yeah, keep that in mind. In this case, on our example to the right, we can hear the sound elements very clearly. And Dixie's laugh after he kicks out the smaller chicken, it's super clear and super precise, and we don't miss it. Whereas on the example on the left, that doesn't happen. Like, the music is being the main character all the time, and sometimes some of the sound elements are lost in the mix. And that's probably a little bit undesirable because we want a little bit of diegetic sound, which is the sound that's happening in the story. And sometimes we want extra diegetic sound, which is sound that's happening outside the story, which is generally this kind of music. So yeah, just be aware and have emotional intelligence for this kind of stuff. Let's round it up and talk about our key takeaways for every core area of feedback. In storytelling, sync intention to action. In this style of film, a film that requires and calls for a lot of Mickey Mousing. Sync it. Support emotional shifts and think like a storyteller. In terms of composition, repetition is king. We like repetition. but also variation and transformation, but without losing our core musical ideas. Tempo and rhythm are key. Use them to your advantage to build energy and to build momentum. And then think sections and development tied to storytelling. Like our composition in film scoring is never tied to itself, it has to be tied to the story we're telling. In terms of orchestration and arrangement, use instrument families intentionally, double, layer, and support. And instrumentation can support character design or emotional design or any kind of design that falls again within the storytelling realm. And finally, production. Create a shared space that makes sense between elements and study style mixing. If you're doing gypsy jazz, study gypsy jazz, learn how it sounds like beyond the musical scope of things. Program MIDI like a performer, think like a performer. Ask your friends, does this sound realistic? Just make musician friends that play instruments, and don't be afraid of feedback. Feedback is great. Be a feedback junkie. Ask for feedback all the time and your programming will be better. Your music feedback in every area, actually. Your composition, your storytelling, your production, everything will be better if you ask for constant feedback from people you trust. And finally, you're part of a mix, not the mix. This is the last thing we talked about during the production section of this video. And a global takeaway from everything is a film composer doesn't just write music, they direct emotion in time. And how you work with your tools, whether they're musical tools, production tools, or storytelling tools, will dictate your voice in an industry that's saturated with voices. So be a composer, but also be a storyteller and learn your storytelling style through your music. I think that's the most important part of the whole thing. Thank you again from the QTube, from the Film Scoring Academy of Europe, and we really hope you have a great time during your next composing gigs, during your next composing exercises, whether you're a student or a professional composer or whatever it is you're doing in life. Have fun. Don't forget that this is a very fulfilling career and keep doing it. It's the only way to keep growing. Thank you so much again and see you soon.